She came to him out of curiosity. He let her go. Never. Some fires start as experiments. Some experiments burn the whole laboratory down. Our story is unfolding right at this moment. The library closed at midnight. Hermione knew this the way she knew everything, precisely, without sentiment, filed away in the part of her mind reserved for facts that required no emotional investment. The torches along the upper shelves burned lower after 11, their light thinning to something amber and unreliable, and Madame Pince's enchantments settled into the stone like a held breath, quieting the usual rustle of self-turning pages and the distant murmur of indexed scrolls rearranging themselves in the restricted section. She had chosen this hour deliberately. The table she occupied was the last one before the eastern wall, tucked behind a column of shelved volumes on advanced arithmetic theory, and 3 rows of untouched encyclopedias that smelled of cedar and slow decay. No one came here at this hour. That was, in fact, the entire point. She had her parchment open, her quill was moving, and she was not thinking about Draco Malfoy. She was categorically, methodically, with great disciplined intent, not thinking about him. The quill stopped. She became aware of him the way you become aware of a change in air pressure before a storm. Not through sight or sound, but through some animal instinct that lived below the reach of reason. The faint bite of his cologne, something cold, resinous, like frost settling over pine, reached her before his footsteps did. And his footsteps were nearly silent, which she had noticed before and resented noticing, because silence was a kind of deliberateness. And deliberateness in Draco Malfoy meant he was thinking, and the idea of him thinking with such quiet precision had always unsettled her in ways she had not yet finished cataloguing. He pulled out the chair across from her without asking. She did not look up. Granger. Malfoy. The syllables were flat, exchanged like coins neither of them wanted. He set his bag down. The leather made a soft, definitive sound against the stone floor, and she heard the rustle of parchment, the uncapping of an ink bottle, the entirely mundane architecture of someone settling in to work. As though he belonged here. As though this corner, her corner, the one she had chosen for its reliable solitude, was simply somewhere he had decided to be. She turned a page she had not finished reading. "You're in my light," she said. "The torches are behind you." She looked up then, because she had no immediate counter to that, and found him already watching her. Not with the old contempt, that particular expression, the one she had memorized across 6 years of being its target, had a specific architecture. The slight curl at the left corner of his mouth, the elevation of his chin, the way his eyes went flat and silver and removed. This was not that. This was something less readable, something she did not have a name for yet, and the absence of a name irritated her more than the looking itself. "What are you working on?" she asked, because asking a question was better than sitting inside the discomfort of being observed. "Potions assessment." He glanced down at his parchment. "You?" "Arithmancy. At 11:30. Some of us have standards for our own work." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smirk, not quite a smile, something unfinished and provisional between the two. "Some of us," he said, "have been here since 9. She had not known that. She reviewed the past 2 hours with sudden, unwanted attention. Had she spoken to herself? She sometimes did, when she was working through a calculation? Had she made any sound that... "You mutter," he said, as though he had heard the question form. "When the numbers don't resolve, it's..." He stopped, looked back at his parchment. "It's not annoying." The qualifications sat between them like something he hadn't intended to leave there. Hermione straightened her already perfectly aligned sleeve cuff and said nothing. It had begun, if she were being precise about origins, and she always was, 6 weeks earlier in an entirely different kind of silence. The 8th year common room, post-war, was an experiment in enforced proximity. Gryffindors and Slytherins sharing a space that belonged fully to neither house, furnished with mismatched armchairs and a fireplace that burned blue on cold nights, for no reason anyone had been able to determine. The Ministry's Reconstruction Initiative had called it a gesture of unity. Hermione had privately thought it looked like an argument waiting to happen. She had been wrong in the way she was occasionally wrong about human beings, not about the argument, but about its shape. The hostility had not erupted. It had instead compressed itself into something more interesting, a taut, charged neutrality, the kind that existed between opposing forces of equal weight. No one hexed anyone. No one sat together either. The room simply held them all in a state of mutual suspended awareness. Draco Malfoy sat nearest the fire most evenings. Not because he claimed the seat, he was never first to arrive, but because whoever was there when he entered invariably found somewhere else to be. He seemed unbothered by this. He read, mostly. Sometimes he sat with nothing in his hands and looked at the blue fire with an expression Hermione had found herself studying more than once, in the peripheral way she studied things she did not want to admit interested her. He looked, in those moments, like someone doing very quiet, very private penance. She had not spoken to him for the first 3 weeks. Then she had, and she wasn't entirely sure who had been more surprised. It was over a potions reference, a legitimate academic need, she had told herself, because his marks in potions were the one thing she had never been able to surpass, and the library's single copy of Moste Potente potions was signed out under his name. She had approached him the way one approached a wary animal, without sudden movements, without warmth, and with a very clear objective. He had given her the book, not grudgingly, not with conditions or commentary. He had simply looked at her for a moment, that unreadable look, the one she still didn't have a name for, and held it out. "You could have just asked Pince to recall it," he said. "I know." She had taken the book and walked away, and he had let her, and that had been the end of it. Except that it hadn't been. The arithmancy parchment in front of her now had not advanced by a single rune in 20 minutes. She was aware of this. She was also aware that the reason was sitting 3 feet away from her, writing in small, precise letters that she was absolutely not trying to read upside down. "Can I ask you something?" she said. The quill did not pause. "You've never asked permission before." "I'm asking now." He looked up. The torchlight from the nearest sconce caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone and threw the other half of his face into shadow. And for a suspended moment the library felt very small and very quiet and very far from anywhere else. "Ask," he said. She had prepared this. She had rehearsed the phrasing, refined it, stripped it of any word that might carry more weight than she intended. She was precise with language, the way she was precise with everything. Because imprecision led to misunderstanding, and misunderstanding led to consequences she hadn't accounted for. Why do you keep ending up wherever I am? The quill lowered. Not quickly. There was no start of surprise, no visible disruption, but with a kind of careful deliberateness, as though he was setting it down rather than dropping it. The library has 47 tables, she continued. You've chosen the one next to mine 4 times in the past 2 weeks. I like the eastern wall. You sat west of the stacks for the entire 6th year. The shadow half of his face shifted. Something in the set of his jaw changed. A minute adjustment, the kind that required you to already be watching closely to catch. She was already watching closely. She realized with a sense of arriving somewhere she hadn't meant to go, been watching closely for some time. Granger. His voice was quiet, not soft. Quiet was different. Quietness had edges, and it moved through the amber-lit air between them with a friction she felt in the hollow of her sternum. What is it you're actually asking? And there it was. The thing she had been precise about not naming, undone by his directness. She resented him for it, and she resented herself for resenting him, and underneath both of those feelings was something that moved like deep water, steady, powerful, disinterested in the weather on the surface. I don't know yet, she said. Honest, because she was always honest, even when it cost her. He looked at her for a long moment. The blue fire wasn't here. Only the fading amber torches and the cedar and decay smell of old encyclopedias and the distant, sleeping breath of the castle settling into midnight. His silver eyes held something she was cataloguing in real time, something that sat between recognition and restraint, and he said, "When you do, let me know." He capped his ink. He gathered his parchment. He left without a sound, the leather bag over one shoulder, and she sat alone in the eastern alcove with her unfinished calculations and the trace of frost over pine that lingered in the air like a question she hadn't finished forming. She looked down at her parchment. In the margin, she had written nothing, but she had drawn, without noticing, a small and perfectly precise asterisk, the kind used in arithmancy to mark a variable whose value remained unknown. She stared at it for a long time. Then she picked up her quill and did not cross it out. She did not sleep well. This was not unusual. Insomnia had been her companion since the war, arriving reliably around 2 a.m, with the particular cruelty of a guest who knows exactly which rooms to haunt. But this was different from the usual architecture of her sleeplessness, different from the dreams that replayed corridors and cold stone, and the particular sound a body makes when a curse finds it. This was quieter, more interior, the kind of wakefulness that had no external cause, and therefore no external remedy. She lay in her bed in the 8th year dormitory and looked at the ceiling and thought about the asterisk. Not about him. About the asterisk. The distinction felt important to maintain. An asterisk in arithmetic notation indicated an unknown quantity, a variable present in the equation whose value had not yet been determined, but whose existence was already affecting the outcome. You could not solve the equation by ignoring it. You could not factor it out. You simply had to acknowledge that something was there, exerting influence, waiting to be named. She was a very good arithmancer. She understood that the asterisk was about him. She pulled her blanket to her chin, turned onto her side, and addressed the darkness with the same methodical honesty she applied to everything else. She had been thinking about Draco Malfoy with increasing frequency for approximately 5 weeks. The thoughts were not warm, or rather, they were not only warm, which was more troubling than if they had been entirely cold. Cold she could have managed. Cold was familiar, was the old language between them, was something she knew how to move through without losing her footing. But this was neither cold nor warm. This was the atmospheric pressure before weather, a dense, expectant stillness that made her feel, in his presence, as though something were about to happen that she had not yet been able to predict. She did not like being unable to predict things. She also did not like that this inability felt, under careful examination, less like frustration and more like anticipation. She turned onto her other side. The dormitory was dark and breathing, the soft, unconscious rhythms of Parvati and the 2 Hufflepuff girls, whose names she always remembered and never used. Normal sounds, grounding sounds. She focused on them deliberately, the way her mind healer had taught her after the war, and eventually something in her chest unclenched by a fraction, and sleep came in sideways, imprecise and thin. She dreamed of a library, amber torches, a silver gaze across a table littered with parchment and unanswered questions. She woke with a particular feeling of someone who has learned something they were not ready for. The morning had the quality of early November. Low grey sky visible through the dormitory windows, the stone floors cold even through her socks, the smell of wood smoke and approaching rain drifting in from somewhere beyond the walls. Hermione dressed with the automatic efficiency of someone who had long ago decided that mornings were functional rather than pleasant, and went down to breakfast and sat beside Ginny and ate toast and listened to the ordinary noise of the great hall with something that felt very much like relief. Ordinary. Everything was ordinary. She was fine. Draco Malfoy entered the great hall at 7:43. She knew this without looking up, knew it from the slight shift in ambient sound, the almost imperceptible recalibration of attention that moved through the room whenever he appeared. The war had made him visible in a new way, not the visibility of status and privilege he had once carried like armor, but something rawer, the visibility of someone who had been on the wrong side and survived it, and who wore that survival without any apparent attempt to make it look like something else. She had heard Pansy Parkinson say once, quietly to Blaise Zabini, that Draco had changed. Blaise had said nothing in response, only turned his glass of pumpkin juice slowly on the table, and that silence had said more than agreement. Hermione did not look at the Slytherin table. She looked at her toast. "You're quiet," Ginny said. "I'm always quiet at breakfast." "You're usually quiet and reading. You're just quiet." Ginny's eyes were sharp and affectionate in equal measure. She had her mother's perception dressed in her own particular brand of directness. "Bad night?" "Arithmancy assessment," Hermione said. "I think I've been approaching the 4th calculation wrong." This was true. It was not the whole truth. She had long understood that true things could be used as shields, and she felt a small private discomfort at using one now. Ginny accepted it with the ease of someone who had learned, through years of friendship, when to press and when to let a thing rest. Neville's having a study group this afternoon if you want company. Maybe. She did not go to Neville's study group, the alcove in the potions corridor, not the classroom itself, but the narrow recessed space between the dungeon staircase and the old storage room that smelled permanently of boomslang skin and burnt copper, was somewhere Hermione had discovered in third year and returned to periodically ever since when she needed to think without being visible. It was too cold to be comfortable, too dark to read by, and too far from the common routes to attract foot traffic. It was, in short, perfectly useless for everything except the specific purpose of standing inside one's own thoughts without interruption. She was standing in it now. She had her arms crossed over her chest, not for warmth, but for the structural feeling of it, and she was conducting an extremely rigorous internal audit of her own decision-making. The facts, as she had established them. She was 23 days from completing her 8th year. She had her newts to sit. She had an apprenticeship in magical law to begin in January, contingent on those results. She had Harry, who was still learning how to be something other than a weapon, and Ron, who was building a life in careful pieces, and Ginny, who was playing Quidditch with a ferocity that looked from the outside like joy and from closer proximity like therapy. She had a full life, well structured with meaningful contents. She had, in short, no available room for complications. Draco Malfoy was a complication, not because of what he had been. She had done the complicated necessary work of distinguishing the person from the circumstances of his formation, and she had arrived at conclusions she didn't share publicly, but held privately with some conviction. Not because of the history, which was real and not nothing, but which she was also capable of holding alongside the present, rather than letting it consume it. He was a complication because of that look, the unreadable one, the one she had been cataloguing for weeks without arriving at a classification. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and looked at the opposite wall and thought with great precision about the words he had said. When you do, let me know. Not an invitation. Not quite. More like a held door, the kind that doesn't swing open dramatically, but simply remains, present, accessible, waiting without impatience. She thought about that quality in him, the waiting without impatience. It was not something she would have attributed to the Draco Malfoy of 5 years ago. That version had been all sharp edges and immediate force, the kind of person who filled a room with pressure rather than presence. This version was different, still sharp, but the edges were turned inward now, and what projected outward was something she didn't have a clean word for. Stillness, perhaps, the hard-won kind. She heard footsteps on the dungeon staircase, the distinctive, near-silent tread she had apparently memorized without intending to, and felt the specific quality of the air in the alcove change the way air changes when a current is introduced. She did not move. She had approximately 3 seconds to decide whether to step out and acknowledge, or remain and hope the shadow of the alcove was sufficient. The footsteps slowed, stopped. "You know," Draco said from the entrance of the alcove, "most people who want to be invisible choose somewhere less architecturally obvious." He was leaning against the stone archway, not crowding the space, not entering, with his bag over one shoulder and his potions textbook under his arm, and that expression that was neither smirk nor smile, the provisional one, the one she was beginning to think was something he had not decided how to classify either. "I wasn't hiding," she said. "You were standing in the dark in a cupboard. It's an alcove. The distinction is doing a lot of work." His gaze moved over her, not slowly, not in a way that felt like an intrusion, but with the attentive precision of someone reading a text for a second time and noticing details they missed on the first pass. "Did you sleep?" The question was quiet. Quiet and direct, and stripped of the layer of deflection she had come to expect from him, the rhetorical armor he deployed the way she deployed academic language, and it reached her in the chest before she could intercept it. "Not particularly," she said. He nodded once, as though this confirmed something. His jaw held a tension she could read now. It lived just below the hinge, a slight, sustained pressure, the kind that came from a question being kept inside rather than released. She watched it. She watched him decide. "The eastern alcove," he said finally, "in the library." He was looking at the middle distance now, at the stone wall behind her left shoulder. "I go there because it's where I can hear the rest of the library without being in it. The sound carries differently there. Pages, quills." A pause, so small it was barely a breath. "You're muttering." She felt something shift in the careful architecture of her composure, a small structural movement, like a single stone settling differently in a wall. "I'm not," she said slowly, "sure what to do with that." "Neither am I." He looked at her directly then, and the thing in his eyes, the thing she had been cataloguing, the unnamed thing, resolved itself for just a moment into something legible. It was not calculation, it was not performance, it was not the remnant of old contempt wearing a new expression. It was, plainly and startlingly, honesty, the uncomfortable kind, the kind that costs something. "That's fairly new for me." The cold of the alcove pressed at her back, the distant smell of boomslang and burnt copper. Somewhere above them, the castle was going about its morning with total indifference to the fact that she was standing in a dark, narrow space with Draco Malfoy, and feeling, with alarming specificity, that the asterisk in her margin had just acquired a value. She didn't name it yet, but she stopped pretending it wasn't there. "I'm going to the library tonight," she said. "After dinner." She held his gaze. The eastern alcove. Something moved across his face. Fast, controlled, but not fast enough. She saw it, the minute release of a held thing, something between relief and resolve, there and then composed over. "The light's better on the eastern side," he said. "The torches are behind me," she said. "You said so yourself." And she walked past him out of the alcove into the dungeon corridor, with the cold at her back and the warmth of something unnamed pressing quietly at the inside of her ribs. She did not look back. She did not need to. She already knew from the absence of retreating footsteps that he was standing very still in the archway, watching her go, and that he was, in his particular silent way, already waiting. The library was quieter on Tuesday evenings. Hermione had established this through simple observation over the course of 8 weeks. Tuesdays had no major assessments due Wednesday, no Quidditch practice to finish early, no social obligations that pushed the common room to capacity and sent its overflow seeking refuge among the stacks. Tuesday evenings, The library belonged to the genuinely studious and the genuinely solitary, and those two categories rarely overlapped enough to disturb each other. She arrived at 7:30. He was already there, not at the eastern alcove table. That would have been too direct, too legible, and she was beginning to understand that Draco Malfoy communicated in the language of strategic indirection, saying things through placement and timing and the precise calibration of distance rather than through words, which he deployed rarely and with the care of someone who had learned the cost of them. He was 3 tables away, in the middle of the library's main floor, bent over what appeared to be a transfiguration text, his quill moving in those small controlled letters she recognized now without needing to see them clearly. She went to the eastern alcove table. She unpacked her bag with her usual methodical efficiency, parchment left of center, inkwell at the upper right, reference texts arranged by relevance in descending order, and opened her arithmancy notes and looked at them and did not look at him. She lasted 6 minutes, not because she lacked discipline. She had discipline in quantities that most people found exhausting. She lasted 6 minutes because at the 6-minute mark he stood, collected his things with that unhurried quiet, and moved, not urgently, not with any apparent awareness of being observed, to the table in the eastern alcove, the one directly across from hers. He sat. He opened his book. He did not look at her either, and somehow the mutual not looking was louder than anything either of them might have said. They worked in silence for an hour. Real work, the kind that actually advanced, the kind where the scratch of quill on parchment had a productive rhythm to it, and the stack of completed notes grew at a satisfying pace. She finished her 4th calculation and moved to the 5th, and the 5th resolved with a clarity that pleased her, and she made a small sound of satisfaction that she did not realize she had made until she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she could only describe as quietly charmed. She looked back down immediately. "The 5th one," he said. She looked up again. "How did you—" "You make a different sound for each one." He said it without inflection, without the smile that would have made it teasing. Simply factual, as though he were reporting an observation he had been sitting with for some time and had decided, finally, to release. "The ones that don't resolve make a low sound here." He touched 2 fingers briefly to his own sternum, an unconscious gesture, like something catching. "The ones that do resolve are lighter." She stared at him. He looked for just a moment as though he wished he had kept it. "I wasn't aware I was doing that," she said. "I know." The candles on the table between them, she hadn't noticed when they'd been lit. They simply were, the way things in Hogwarts simply were, through a warm, unsteady light across the parchment and the gap of air between them. And she thought, with a part of her mind that was always observing, even when the rest of her was occupied, he notices things. He has always noticed things. He just used what he noticed differently before. "Tell me something," she said, before she had decided to say it. He waited. "After the war." She chose each word with the deliberateness of someone stepping across ice they haven't tested. What was it like, the first months?" The quill in his hand stilled. Not a flinch, nothing so dramatic, but a stillness that had weight to it, the specific density of a question landing somewhere it was not casually received. "Why?" he said. because I want to know. Honest. Plain. She watched him process the plainness of it, watched something in the set of his shoulders shift, almost imperceptibly, like a door that hasn't been opened in a long time, moving on its hinges for the first time. Grey, he said finally. It was grey. Everything I'd been told had structure turned out to have none, and I didn't know how to... He stopped. His jaw moved slightly, the sub-hinge tension she could read now. I didn't know what I was building toward. I'd spent 17 years building towards something that turned out to be nothing worth building. He looked at his parchment rather than at her. That's not particularly interesting. It is to me. He looked up. She held the look with a steadiness that was not bravery. Bravery implied fear overcome, and what she felt in this moment was not fear, but something more like the sensation of stepping off a familiar path into unmapped terrain, with full awareness and without quite wanting to turn back. You survived it, she said. The greyness. I'm still surviving it. I know. She said it gently and watched him receive the gentleness with the careful, slightly alarmed expression of someone unaccustomed to it arriving from this particular direction. So am I. The candles shifted in a draft from the high windows, old parchment and cedar, and beneath it, the frost and pine trace that she'd stopped pretending she didn't recognize as specifically his. Granger, he said, and his voice had changed. Lower, stripped of its usual careful armor, carrying something in it that she felt as atmospheric pressure in the space between her shoulder blades. Hermione, she said. He blinked. One slow, arrested blink. My name, she clarified, though he clearly did not need clarification. You can. It's fine, if you want. He was quiet for a moment that had texture to it, that pressed against the skin the way humidity does before rain. Hermione, he said, testing it. Careful. The way you say a word in a foreign language for the first time when you are serious about learning it. Not performing fluency, but genuinely reaching for something. It did something completely unreasonable to the inside of her chest. She looked back at her parchment. I should finish the 6th calculation. You should, he agreed. And she could hear, she was almost certain she could hear, the shadow of something warmer than his usual tone, restrained and provisional, but present. They worked until the library closed. She told herself, walking back to the common room with the smell of candle wax still in her hair, that this was simply recalibration, updating her model of a person based on new data. She had been wrong about him before in both directions, and intellectual honesty required her to keep updating. That was all this was. She told herself this with great conviction until she reached the portrait hole. Then she stood in front of it for a moment and thought about the way he had said her name, the way it had sounded like something he was keeping. And the fat lady waited, and Hermione gave the password and climbed through and sat in the armchair nearest the fire and stared into it. She did not update her model that evening. She simply sat with the data and let it be what it was. The next morning, everything was ordinary again. Or she made it ordinary, which was not the same thing, but served the same function. She had toast. She had her notes. She had the comfortable, grounding routine of morning, classes and assessments, and the particular pleasure of understanding things clearly. She had Ginny's running commentary on the upcoming Quidditch match, and Harry's quiet presence beside her, and the warm institutional noise of the great hall doing its reliable morning work. She was fine. She did not look at the Slytherin table. She lasted until potions. Slughorn had arranged the workbenches in pairs for the day's practical, something about the assessment requiring peer observation, and she had arrived early enough that she should have had her choice of partner. She had chosen the bench second from the left and unpacked her ingredients with the precision that was second nature, and she was examining a sprig of valerian root for optimal cutting length when she became aware of someone setting their kit down at the other side of her bench. She did not look up immediately. She counted 3 deliberate breaths. Then she looked up. Draco stood across the bench from her with his ingredients already arranged. She noted with a reluctant internal acknowledgement that his arrangement was the mirror image of hers. Same logical progression from most to least volatile, same positioning of the mortar, and his expression was composed and neutral and almost entirely successful at concealing the thing underneath it that she could now identify as awareness. The particular awareness of someone in the presence of something they are thinking about carefully. "The remaining places are all taken," he said. She looked around. They were not. She looked back at him. The corner of his mouth moved, that unfinished thing, not yet a smile. "I work more efficiently with someone whose standards are—" He paused, considering the word with visible deliberateness. "Comparable." "That is an extraordinarily indirect compliment," she said. "I don't know what you're referring to." He uncapped his first ingredient. "Are we beginning, or—" "We're beginning," she said, and bent over her valerian root, and the lesson proceeded with the particular charged efficiency of 2 people who are both pretending very hard to be focused entirely on what is in front of them, and both aware that the other is doing the same. Their methods, she discovered, were nearly identical. Same sequence, same timing, same instinct for when to reduce heat and when to let the potion find its own pace. They did not need to discuss any of it. The synchronization was simply there, immediate and slightly unnerving, as though they had been working together for a long time rather than for the first time. Slughorn passed their bench, peered at the contents of their cauldron with his walrus-moustached approval, and moved on without comment, which from him was the highest possible mark. "You add the bitter root before the temperature drops," she said, near the end of the practical. Not a correction. Their potion was already perfect. Simply an observation. "I know," he said. "I was watching you to see if you did." She kept her eyes on the cauldron. "And?" "You do." A pause, the length of a heartbeat. "It's better that way." She thought with a part of her mind she was trying very hard to keep closed. He is talking about the bitter root. She thought with the part she could not close. He is not only talking about the bitter root. She straightened the already straight edge of her parchment. He watched her do it. Neither of them said anything else. After class, walking back through the dungeon corridor toward the staircase, she made a decision. Quietly, internally, without announcing it. The decision was this. She would not go to the library tonight. She would go tomorrow, or not at all, or she would rearrange her study schedule, which was already optimized, but could sustain one adjustment. And she would put some structural distance between this thing, this undefined, unclassified thing, and the forward motion of her otherwise coherent life. It was a sensible decision. It was, she was almost entirely certain, the right one. She went to the library that evening. She was there at 7:30. She did not examine why. She simply opened her parchment, arranged her inkwell at the upper right, and waited for the particular shift in air pressure that meant the frost and pine scent was about to arrive, and thought with a precision she usually reserved for arithmancy. The asterisk has a value. I just haven't written it down yet. The library door opened. She did not look up. She didn't need to. It happened on a Thursday. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of narrative architecture that retrospect sometimes imposes on moments that felt, while you were inside them, simply like weather. It happened the way most significant things happen, quietly in the margins of an ordinary evening, without warning and without the decency to announce itself as the thing it was. They had developed, without discussing it, a rhythm. The library, Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The eastern alcove, always. Him already there, or arriving within minutes of her. She had stopped tracking which of them arrived first, because the information was doing nothing productive for her internal equilibrium. They worked. They spoke occasionally, in the careful, precise way of two people who had tacitly agreed that words were significant and should be used accordingly. They did not discuss what they were doing. They did not name the thing that lived in the air between them, in the draught from the high windows and the amber torchlight, and the particular silence that had its own acoustic texture, different from any other silence she had sat inside. She had decided, 4 separate times in the preceding week, to stop coming. She was here now for the 3rd Thursday running. The decision-making apparatus, she acknowledged privately, was not functioning at its usual standard. Tonight, he had arrived first. She saw him from the entrance of the library, his pale head bent over a text, the familiar economical posture, one hand flat on the parchment and the other holding his quill at the slightly unconventional angle she had noticed and catalogued without intending to. He had not looked up when she entered. He did not perform awareness of her the way some people did, the way she had encountered in others, the studied casualness that was more conspicuous than simple attention. He simply continued reading, and when she reached the table and set her bag down, he said, without lifting his eyes from the page, "The 3rd floor corridor is flooded. Peeves got into the charm supply cupboard." "How do you know where I was coming from?" "You always come from the 3rd floor on Thursdays. You have a free period before this that you spend in the charms classroom working ahead." He turned a page. "Pince mentioned the flooding when I came in." She sat down, arranged her things, processed the fact that he knew her Thursday schedule with a thoroughness that should have been unsettling and was, instead, something she could not cleanly categorize. "You know my timetable," she said. "You've mentioned your schedule in passing several times." He looked up then, briefly, and the candlelight caught the silver of his eyes and did something complicated with it. "I listen when you talk." She opened her parchment. Her sleeve cuffs were already perfectly straight. She straightened them anyway. An hour into the evening, the atmosphere changed. She felt it before she identified it. A shift in the quality of the silence, a change in the particular texture of the air between them that had, she now understood, its own grammar. She looked up from her work and found him sitting back from his text with his quill set aside, his hands resting on the table, looking at nothing with the expression she had catalogued as private penance. The blue fire expression. Stripped of deflection, stripped of the careful, composed surface he wore through the school day, containing something she had learned to recognize as the specific exhaustion of someone who spent considerable energy simply existing inside their own history. She set her quill down. "Tell me something," she said. The same words she had used before, their version of an opening. He came back from wherever he had been slowly, like surfacing from deep water. His eyes found her face with a focus that felt, when it arrived, like something physical, like a change in air pressure, like the moment before a storm commits to itself. "My father wrote to me last week," he said. She waited. He wanted to know if I'd reconsidered the apprenticeship at Borgin and Burke's. His voice was level. The levelness was doing significant structural work. He still believes, he still operates as though the world is the shape it was 5 years ago. As though, if he simply continues to behave as he always has, reality will eventually come back into alignment with his expectations. A pause. His right hand, resting on the table, closed into a loose configuration that wasn't quite a fist, just a gathering of the fingers, a small internal bracing. I don't know if that's denial or if he genuinely can't see it. "What did you write back?" "I haven't." He looked at the table surface. "I've been sitting with it." Another pause, the kind that had texture. "I'm good at sitting with things." "I know," she said, and the gentleness was there again in her voice, the same gentleness that had alarmed him before, and this time he received it differently, not with alarm, but with a careful, almost tentative stillness, the way you hold yourself when something fragile has been placed in your hands unexpectedly. "He's not," Draco began, and stopped, and she watched him locate the honest version of whatever he had almost said. "He's not beyond being loved. My mother loves him. The hand on the table shifted, a small involuntary movement. "It's complicated to love someone whose choices you can't defend." "Yes," she said quietly. "It is." He looked at her. There was a question in the look, and she answered it. "My parents don't remember the war. They remember being happy in Australia and not knowing why they'd gone. I restored their memories. I did it properly. I checked. Everything came back intact. But there are moments when I wonder if what I gave back to them is exactly what was there before, or whether something in the restoration is slightly off, a degree of arc, almost imperceptible." She looked at her parchment rather than at him, because this was easier to say to a fixed point. "I can't ask them. It would hurt them to know I'm uncertain, so I sit with it." The silence that followed had a different quality than their usual silences. Something had been placed in it. 2 specific, private things, set down side by side in the candlelit air between them, not requiring comparison or resolution, simply occupying the same space. "Hermione," he said. She looked up. "Thank you." He said it without qualification, without the rhetorical frame that might have made it easier to receive. Simply, "Thank you," direct, from the place where he kept the things that cost him. She felt the impact of it in the fine bones of her sternum. "Don't thank me," she said. "I didn't do anything." "You listened without trying to solve it." His eyes were steady on hers. "That's not nothing." They stayed until the torches had burned down to their lowest amber. When they finally packed their things, the library was entirely empty. Madame Pince had done her closing rounds an hour ago, and, finding them both legitimately studious and miraculously quiet, had dimmed the far torches and left them to it with the air of someone making a calculated exception. The resulting intimacy of the space was accidental. Hermione was aware of it the way you are aware of temperature, not dramatically, simply as a fact of the environment. She was pulling on her cardigan. November had truly arrived in the dungeons, and its representatives had reached even the library, when she dropped her wand. It happened with the mundane swiftness of all undramatic accidents. The wand hit the stone floor and skittered 2 feet to the left, coming to rest against the leg of his chair. He bent and retrieved it in the same motion, unhurried, and held it out. She reached for it. His fingers did not immediately release it. Not forcefully. There was no grip, no detention. Simply a moment of non-release, a half-second in which both their hands were on the wand and the candlelight was doing its final amber work, and the library breathed its sleeping breath around them, and she was close enough to see the exact quality of his attention, close enough to register the faint warmth emanating from his skin across the narrow distance. She felt it where her fingers overlapped the end of the wand, not the wood, but the adjacent edge of his hand. The bite of his silver ring against her knuckle, cool metal, body temperature beneath, a small, specific, visceral point of contact. Her breath did not change. She was very controlled about her breath. His eyes moved from the wand to her face in a single, deliberate arc. And what she saw in them in that moment was not the composed surface, not the careful armor, not the provisional, almost smile. It was the thing underneath all of it, unguarded, undefended, carrying the weight of something that had been building for weeks, with the slow, inexorable pressure of water behind stone. He released the wand. She straightened up. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was entirely steady, which was a significant personal achievement. He said, which was not a word, but communicated with perfect clarity. They walked out of the library side by side, not touching, and turned at the corridor junction where their routes diverged. She toward Gryffindor Tower, he toward the dungeons. And she said goodnight with the composed practicality of someone who had absolutely everything under control. And he said goodnight with the restraint of someone who had considerably more to say and had elected not to say it. And they went in their separate directions. She was 3 corridors away before she became aware that she was pressing her right hand, specifically the knuckle where his ring had made contact against the fabric of her cardigan. She stopped walking, stood in the empty corridor, looked at her own hand with the expression of someone who has caught themselves doing something that requires examination. The stone was cold. Somewhere above her, the castle shifted in its ancient, dreaming way. A torch in the bracket to her left threw orange light across the old flags of the floor, and she stood in it and breathed and thought with every ounce of her considerable analytical capacity about the thing she had been refusing to name. It had a name. It had had a name for some time. She had been conducting her refusal with great technical skill, rerouting every path of honest inquiry before it arrived at the obvious destination. But the destination had been there the whole time, patient as architecture, waiting for the moment when she ran out of detours. She was in detour collapse. The name was this. She wanted to know what it would be like with him. Not abstractly. She was not. She had always been honest about this. A person who experienced desire in abstractions. Concretely. Specifically. She wanted to know what the careful, controlled, restrained person across the library table was, like in the absence of all that restraint. She was a scientist. She had always learned best through direct experience. She examined this thought for the space of 6 measured breaths. Then she made a decision. Real this time, not the kind she immediately unmade. Deliberate and clear-eyed, and entered into with full knowledge of the variables. Not because she was swept away, because she had chosen. She was always better, she had found, when she chose. She turned around. She walked back the way she had come, toward the staircase that led to the dungeons, with her wand in her right hand and her pulse at a steady, controlled rate, and the cold November air of the corridor moving around her like water. And she did not let herself slow down or reconsider, because reconsideration was not what this moment required. What it required was exactly what she was doing, going toward the thing she had stopped pretending she didn't want. She found him on the 7th step from the bottom of the dungeon staircase. He had stopped there, not sitting, simply stopped, one hand against the cold stone wall, his bag over his shoulder, looking at the middle distance with the particular quality of someone whose body has continued moving while their mind has stayed somewhere else entirely. The torches in the dungeon stairwell were spaced wider than elsewhere in the castle, and the gaps between them held a darkness that had texture and weight. And he stood at the edge of one such gap with the amber light from below catching the line of his jaw and leaving everything above it in shadow. He heard her footsteps and turned. She watched him process her presence, watched the sequence move across his face in the space of 2 seconds, fast and almost entirely suppressed, but not entirely. Surprise, then something that pulled tight and careful over the surprise like a curtain drawn quickly. Then, beneath both of those, the thing she had been cataloguing for weeks, present and undisguised for just a moment before the composition reasserted itself. "You walked the wrong direction," he said. "I know." He waited. This was one of the things she had come to understand about him, the waiting. He did not fill silences with noise. He held them the way you hold something whose weight you are assessing. She had rehearsed nothing. She had deliberately allowed herself no rehearsal, because rehearsal would have given the rational part of her mind the opportunity to construct objections, and the rational part of her mind was extremely good at objections, and she had heard enough of them already. "I want," she began, and stopped, and tried again with greater precision. "I've been thinking about something, and I think the only intellectually honest thing to do is to simply tell you what I'm thinking, because anything else would be a kind of Hermione." His voice was quiet. The curtain had come down, fully this time. He was looking at her with that direct, undefended attention, and his voice held the specific gentleness of someone who can see where something is going and wants to make the arrival easier. You don't have to build an argument for it. She stopped, looked at him. "Whatever it is," he said, "you don't have to justify it to me." She felt something release in her chest, some held structural tension, the kind that had been there so long she had stopped registering it as held. She breathed. "I want to know you," she said. "More than I do. Differently than I do." She kept her eyes on his face with the steadiness that was not fearlessness, but was the deliberate override of fear, which was the more honest kind of courage. "I think you know what I mean." The stairwell was very quiet. The amber torch below threw their shadows long and overlapping up the stone steps, and somewhere deep in the dungeons, something dripped with a hollow, patient rhythm, and Draco Malfoy looked at her from the 7th step with an expression she could finally, fully read. It was the expression of someone receiving something they had wanted for long enough that the wanting had become structural, built into the architecture of daily life, and who had, by this point, largely stopped believing the wanting would ever be answered. He descended the remaining steps. He stopped in front of her, close, not crowding, not demanding, but within the distance where breath becomes mutual and the warmth of another body registers against your skin before any touch has been made. She could see, at this proximity, the fine texture of the shadows under his eyes. The same sleeplessness that lived in her own mornings, apparently, etched into him with the same patient hand. "I know what you mean," he said. What followed lived afterward in the part of her memory that stored sensory experience rather than narrative. Not a sequence of events she could recount linearly, but a collection of specific physical textures that returned when she was not guarding against them. The cold of the dungeon air and the contrasting warmth of him. The silver ring against her wrist where his hand had been. The smell of frost and pine resin, close and then closer. The stone wall at her back, grained and absolute. The specific quality of his breathing, which was controlled and then not controlled, careful and then not careful, and the precise moment of that transition, the moment the restraint gave way, which she felt before she heard it, felt it as a change in atmospheric pressure, the held thing finally released. He had been gentle in a way she hadn't anticipated and couldn't have predicted. Not tentative, nothing so qualified, but attentive in the way he was attentive to everything, with complete focus, with the quality of someone reading something they want to understand, rather than simply to finish. She had understood in the midst of it that she was being paid attention to in a way she had not been before, and that understanding had done something to the carefully maintained composure she had brought into the evening. The composure had not survived. She had not minded. Afterward, the silence had a different quality than any silence she had sat inside with him before. They were still in the stairwell. She was aware this was not a dignified location, had been aware of this during, had found that awareness significantly less compelling than she might have expected. And the torch below still burned its amber, and the drip from the deep dungeons still marked its patient time. And she was looking at the opposite wall, and he was looking at the same wall, and neither of them was speaking. She was conducting an internal assessment of her own condition and finding the results unusual. She felt clear. Not the clarity of a solved equation, not the satisfaction of a thing completed and filed. Something more unsettled than that, more alive, like a window opened in a room that has been closed for a long time. The air moving through was cold. The cold was not unpleasant. She felt his attention shift before he spoke. felt it in the slight change in his posture beside her, the minute adjustment that preceded, she had learned, the decision to say something real. "Hermione." His voice had changed, not dramatically. The restraint was still there, the careful architecture of him was still largely intact. But something in the lower register had altered. Something rougher and more exposed, the voice of someone speaking from behind rather than in front of themselves. She turned her head. He was looking at her with an expression she had no category for. Not the unreadable look, not the private penance expression, not the provisional, almost smile. This was new. This was something she was encountering for the first time, and she was aware, with the focused attention she brought to all new data, that it required careful reception. His eyes moved over her face, not in the assessing way, not cataloguing, but in the way of someone looking at something they are attempting to memorize. "You've done this before," he said. Not a question, not an accusation, simply stated. A fact he was placing carefully between them for examination. She held the look. "What makes you say that?" Something shifted in his face. A series of small, rapid adjustments, the expression of someone revising a conclusion in real time. His jaw held its tension for a moment. Then, "You haven't." It was not a question either. She did not answer immediately. She was deciding, with the deliberateness she brought to all significant decisions, what the honest answer required of her. The honest answer required, she concluded, simply the truth, stated plainly, without the defensive scaffolding she might have constructed around it. "No," she said. The quality of the silence changed again. She watched it move through him, watched something she could not name travel from his expression down through the set of his shoulders and into the hand nearest her, which closed slowly against his thigh, the silver ring catching the amber light. "Hermione," he said, and stopped. "Don't," she said, with more composure than she felt. "Don't make it into something that requires management. It was a choice. It was my choice. I made it with full information, and without being—" She paused, selected the precise word. "Swept away. I don't want you to be careful with me retroactively." He was very still. "That's not—" He stopped again. His hand opened against his thigh, slowly, the ring catching the amber light in a brief, sharp arc. "That's not what I was doing." "What were you doing?" He looked at her. That direct, undefended attention, the full weight of it, and it pressed against her sternum the way it always did, the atmospheric pressure of being fully seen by someone who is also choosing to let you see them. "I was trying to find the right words," he said, "for something I don't think has right words." She waited. He looked at the wall, then back at her. "I'm not going to pretend this was—" He made a small, controlled gesture with one hand, the kind that indicated the inadequacy of all available language. "That this was something I can be unmoved by. You should know that." She processed this, processed the deliberateness of it, the care with which he had constructed it. Not a declaration, not a demand, not any of the things that might have required her to respond in kind or to retreat. Simply information, offered honestly, in the understanding that she would do with it what she would. She felt, in response to it, something she immediately identified and immediately attempted to reclassify, and found she could not reclassify, because it was too specific and too warm and too present to be anything other than what it was. she felt moved. She did not show it. Or she showed it only in the way she always showed things she hadn't decided to show. The slight change in the quality of her breathing, the particular stillness that came over her when something had landed fully rather than glancing. He saw it. Of course, he saw it. He noticed things. "I should go," she said. The words were steady. The necessity behind them was real. Not retreat, she told herself. Not retreat, but space. The kind of space that allowed you to understand what had just happened before the next thing happened. He nodded. One slow, deliberate nod, containing no disappointment, or containing it and holding it so still it was indistinguishable from acceptance. She pushed off the wall, picked up her bag, put herself back together with the automatic efficiency of long practice. At the foot of the staircase, she stopped and turned back, because there was something that needed to be said, and she was not going to be the person who didn't say it, simply because saying it required exposure. "Draco," she said, his name in her mouth for the first time, and she watched it reach him, watched the small arrested movement it produced, the half-breath, the rapid recomposition. "I meant what I said. It was a choice, a considered one." She held his gaze. "I don't make unconsidered choices." He looked at her from the 7th step, where he had returned to at some point, without her noticing. And the amber light was doing its work on the sharp angles of his face, and his expression was the new one, the one she didn't have a category for yet. "I know you don't," he said. She turned and walked up toward the ground floor, and the cold of the corridor closed around her like water, and she moved through it toward the warm, distant noise of the castle's inhabited spaces. And she did not press her hand against anything this time. She simply walked and breathed and allowed herself, just briefly, just for the length of 3 corridors, to feel the full, unmanaged weight of what the evening had been. Then she tucked it somewhere careful and went to bed, and lay in the dark, looking at the ceiling, knowing with the precision of someone who has stopped deceiving themselves that sleep was not coming, and that the asterisk in her margin had not just acquired a value, it had acquired a name. She was not ready to write it down, but she knew what it was. She avoided him for 4 days, not dramatically. She was not, by nature, a dramatic person. Drama required a kind of performed externalization of internal states that she had always found both exhausting and imprecise. She avoided him the way she did most things she needed to manage, systematically with planning and with the outward appearance of simply being very busy, which she always was, which made the architecture of avoidance nearly invisible. She changed her library schedule. Tuesdays she went to the charms classroom instead. Professor Flitwick had left it unlocked for independent study, and it had the advantage of being on the 3rd floor, nowhere near the eastern alcove, nowhere near the particular amber quality of those torches, or the cedar and decay smell of the encyclopedias she had stopped being able to think of as neutral. Thursdays she went to the astronomy tower with Ginny, ostensibly to watch the November meteor shower, actually to sit in the cold open air and feel the sky above her and the stone beneath her and the reassuring immensity of everything that had nothing to do with dungeon stairwells and silver rings and the specific quality of a voice saying her name for the first time. She worked. She ate. She slept badly and did not examine why with any particular rigor. She told herself this was sensible, proportionate. She had made a choice, a considered one. She stood by that. And she was now in the necessary period of integration, the time required to absorb the data before proceeding. This was not avoidance. This was processing. She was an extremely good liar when the person she was lying to was herself. On the 5th day, she found a note on her dormitory pillow. Not a letter, no envelope, no seal, no preamble. A single piece of parchment, folded once, her name on the outside in small, precise letters that she recognized without needing to compare them to anything. The handwriting was controlled and slightly angular, the kind that results from someone who was taught penmanship formally and has since developed their own modifications to the approved form. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at it for longer than was strictly necessary. Then she opened it. The library has been quiet. D. 2 sentences, 7 words. She read them 3 times, which was 4 times fewer than she actually read them, and then she folded the parchment back along its original crease and set it on her bedside table and looked at the opposite wall. He had not said, "Where have you been?" He had not said, "I need to speak with you," or "we should talk," or any of the formulations that would have required her to respond to a demand. He had said, "The library has been quiet," a statement of fact, an observation offered without pressure, without claim, in the exact register of someone who has decided to make themselves known without making themselves a burden. She picked the note up again, read it again, set it down, stood up with the brisk decisiveness of someone who has finished a deliberation they are not going to revisit, and went to find her arithmancy notes and spent the next 2 hours working through a problem set with a focus that was approximately 60% genuine. The note stayed on her bedside table. She did not put it away. The thing she was processing, the thing she refused to call fear, because fear implied irrationality, and her response to this situation was entirely rational, was this. She had not expected to feel that much. She had approached the evening on the dungeon staircase with the same methodology she brought to all new experiences. Clear objective, controlled conditions, full prior information, expected outcomes mapped. She had expected to feel something. Curiosity satisfied. The data point acquired. A thing understood that had previously been only theoretical. She had not expected the particular quality of his attention to make her feel, for the first time in recent memory, entirely present in her own body rather than observing it from the slight analytical distance she maintained as a matter of habit. She had not expected to feel afterward not satisfied, but opened, not completed, but begun. That was the problem. Satisfaction she could have filed and moved forward from. Opened was a different condition entirely. Opened meant there was now a space that had not existed before, and spaces, in Hermione's experience, did not remain empty. They either filled with something, or they ached with the specific, persistent discomfort of their own unfilled shape. She was experiencing the aching. She did not want to want more. Wanting more was the mechanism by which sensible people made unsensible decisions, and she had a life that was structured and purposeful and moving in a clear direction, and Draco Malfoy was complicated, morally complex, carrying a history that intersected with her own at points that still, if she pressed on them, were tender. He was not a simple addition to an already coherent life. He was the kind of person who left 7-word notes on pillows. The kind who noticed which sound you made when an equation resolved. The kind who said I was trying to find the right words for something I don't think has right words and meant it, plainly and without performance. And somehow that plainness made it more rather than less disarming. She looked at her arithmancy notes. She looked at the note on her bedside table. She acknowledged with the intellectual honesty she owed herself, in a significant amount of trouble. She went to the library on Thursday, the eastern alcove, 7:30. She unpacked her things with the automatic efficiency of habit and sat down and looked at the empty chair across from her and felt the quality of its emptiness with a specificity that was new and unwelcome and entirely informative. He was not there. She worked. The arithmancy advanced at its usual pace. The 6th calculation, the 7th, the 8th, with its elegant resolution that normally produced the quiet sound of satisfaction. The sound she made was slightly off. She noticed this with the detached clarity of someone listening to an instrument slightly out of tune. At 9 o'clock, she became aware of footsteps. They were not his footsteps, not the near silent, deliberate tread she had memorized. These were heavier, less careful, the footsteps of someone not thinking about how they moved. She looked up and found Blaise Zabini standing at the entrance to the eastern alcove with an expression of mild amusement and the particular ease of someone entirely comfortable in their own skin. "Granger," he said. "Zabini." He looked at the empty chair across from her with a specific kind of theatrical innocence that she distrusted immediately. Quiet corner. I prefer it that way. He leaned against the bookshelf, not quite entering the alcove, occupying its threshold with studied casualness. "He's in the common room," he said, "in case you were wondering." She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't." "Of course not." He examined the spine of the nearest encyclopedia with apparent interest. "He's been in the common room every evening this week, which is new, since he's usually—" a gesture toward the alcove, loose and eloquent. "Here, also new, he's been insufferable company, silently insufferable, which is somehow worse." She kept her expression composed. "I'm not sure why you're telling me this." "I'm telling you," Zabini said, with the air of someone who has decided to be direct and is doing so as a personal favor. "Because he won't. He'll sit in the common room being silently awful for another 3 weeks before he says a word, because that's how he's built." His dark eyes were sharp and not unkind. "I'm not built that way." She looked at her parchment, then back at him. "Is he all right?" The question came out before she had approved it for release. She heard it land in the air between them and felt the specific discomfort of having revealed something she had intended to keep interior. Zabini's expression shifted, the amusement softening into something more genuine. "He's Draco," he said. "So, he's fine, obviously, and he'll tell anyone who asks that he's fine with complete conviction, and meanwhile, he's doing that thing where he—" He paused, selecting. "Goes very still and very quiet, and thinks about something so hard you can almost hear it." He pushed off the bookshelf. "Just thought you should know." He walked away with the unhurried confidence of someone who has delivered their message and considers their work complete. She sat in the alcove for a long time after he left. She found Draco in the 8th year common room at 9:30. He was in the armchair nearest the blue fire. Of course he was. He was always in that armchair, as though some gravitational principle placed him there, with a book open in his lap that he was visibly not reading. His eyes were on the fire, and his expression was the private penance one, and his right hand rested on the chair arm with the silver ring turned inward against his palm. And he looked, she found the precise word without difficulty, lonely, with the specific, well-practiced loneliness of someone who has been lonely for long enough that it no longer feels like a condition, but simply like the texture of existence. The common room had a handful of other occupants. Neville in the corner with his herbology diagrams, 2 Hufflepuff girls sharing headphones connected to a muggle radio someone had charmed to function inside the wards. No one was paying attention to the armchair by the fire. She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his. He turned his head. Whatever he had expected, and she could see the rapid inventory of expectations moving through his expression, all of them apparently wrong. It was not this. She looked at the blue fire. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," she said. "This week." He was quiet. "I needed—" She chose the words with her usual care, but carefully, this time in a different direction, toward honesty rather than away from it. "To understand what I was feeling before I could be in the same room with you. I'm better at things when I've processed them." The fire shifted, blue deepening at its center. She felt, rather than saw him turn to look at her. "And have you?" he said. "Processed them." She looked at him then. He was close, armchairs, proximity, the warmth of the fire between them and around them, the familiar frost and pine scent, and the silver ring catching the blue light differently than the amber, cooler, more precise. "I've processed enough," she said. His expression moved. The new one, the one without a category, the one she had been attempting to classify since the stairwell. Up close, in the blue firelight, she could see it more clearly than she had before, and what she saw made the aching space in her chest do something complicated and warm. He was hopeful, under all the control, under the careful stillness, under the composed surface that had been constructed over years of necessity. Hopeful, tentatively, structurally, in the way of someone who has learned to hold hope at arm's length because it has cost them before, but holding it nonetheless. She reached out and touched the back of his hand, not dramatically, not as punctuation to a declaration. Simply placed her hand over his, her fingers against the cool silver ring and the warmer skin beneath, a small and deliberate point of contact. His hand turned under hers, slowly, and his fingers, careful as everything else about him, closed around hers. The blue fire burned. Neville turned a page in his corner. The Hufflepuff girls laughed quietly at something from the radio, and Hermione sat beside Draco Malfoy with her hand in his and looked at the fire and felt the aching space begin with the particular patience of something that has been waiting a long time to fill. She did not name it out loud. She didn't need to. It was already writing itself in the margins of everything, in letters too large now to mistake for anything but what they were. The hand-holding lasted 4 minutes. She knew this because she had been tracking time with the automatic precision of someone whose mind does not fully disengage, even in moments that deserve disengagement. And 4 minutes was how long it took for Pansy Parkinson to enter the common room, stop at the threshold, Observe the configuration of Hermione's hand inside Draco's, with an expression that cycled through surprise, calculation, and something that resolved unexpectedly into a careful neutrality, and then continue into the room without comment. Hermione did not pull away. This was notable. Her first instinct had been exactly that: the reflexive retraction, the restoration of appropriate distance, the management of observed vulnerability. She had felt the instinct arrive and had, with deliberate intention, declined to act on it. Her hand stayed where it was. Draco's fingers remained closed around hers, and he had noticed Pansy's entrance and had also not moved. And this shared not moving felt like its own kind of statement, quiet and mutual, and more significant than anything either of them had said. Pansy sat across the room and opened a magazine and did not look at them again. At the 4-minute mark, Hermione became aware that Neville was gathering his diagrams with the particular rustling efficiency of someone preparing to leave, and that his departure would reduce the room's population to a level that made the hand-holding feel less like something occurring in the shelter of ordinary social noise, and more like something exposed and deliberate and requiring acknowledgement. She was not ready for acknowledgement. She gave his hand a single, slight pressure, not withdrawal, not punctuation, something between the two, and moved her fingers from his with the composure of someone who has made a considered decision rather than a retreating one. She felt him let go without resistance, without any adjustment of expression, accepting the shift with the particular stillness that she now understood was not indifference, but its opposite. He felt things completely and controlled the feeling completely, and the controlling looked, from outside, like not feeling, and she knew better now. "I should sleep," she said quietly. "You won't," he said, equally quietly, and the accuracy of it, the simple, undecorated accuracy, did something to the carefully maintained surface of her composure. "Probably not," she admitted. He looked at her with the firelight blue on one side of his face and the room's ordinary light on the other, and she thought, he is two things at once, always. The composed surface and the thing underneath, the restraint and the cost of it, the person he was made to be and the person choosing, daily, with apparent effort and genuine conviction, to be something else. "Good night, Draco," she said. "Good night, Hermione," he said, and her name in his mouth still did the thing to her chest that it had done the first time, and she suspected, with the analytical honesty she owed herself, that it would continue doing that thing for a considerable time. She went to bed. She did not sleep. The following morning arrived with frost on the inside of the dormitory windows. The castle's heating charms were imperfect in November, and the upper floors surrendered to the temperature in ways the lower floors did not. Hermione lay in her bed and watched the frost patterns on the glass and thought with great precision about the decision she had not yet made. Because there was a decision. She understood this now, in the cold clarity of early morning, with the blue fire long extinguished, and the hand-holding in the manageable past, and her mind returned to its usual operating temperature. There was a decision, and she had been avoiding making it by treating each individual moment as its own discrete event, rather than as part of a sequence with a direction. The sequence had a direction. She knew what direction it was moving in. She had known since the note on her pillow. 7 words, 2 sentences, the precise, calibrated understatement of someone who communicated in the language of what they did not say. And possibly before that, possibly since the dungeon stairwell, possibly since the potion's practical and the bitter root, and the thing he had not only been talking about. The direction was toward him. The question was whether she was going to walk in that direction deliberately, with her eyes open and her intentions examined and her fears acknowledged and set aside, or whether she was going to continue the current approach of being pulled there incrementally, moment by moment, without ever formally choosing it. She was not, she had always known, a person who did things by accident. She sat up. The frost on the windows was precise and intricate, ice crystals arranging themselves in branching patterns that followed mathematical principles she could name. She looked at them and thought about structure, about the way things that appear organic and spontaneous are, on examination, governed by deep underlying rules, about how knowing the rules did not diminish the pattern. It made it more remarkable, made the beauty of it more legible, not less. She got dressed. She went to breakfast. She ate toast. She watched him enter the great hall at 7:43. She accepted without self-reproach, memorized this, and sit at the Slytherin table and open his coffee with the same efficiency she brought to her own morning. And she watched Blaise Zabini sit beside him and say something that produced the provisional corner-of-the-mouth response. And she watched Draco not look at her table and understood, from the quality of the not looking, that it was deliberate, that he was giving her room, that he had assessed the situation with his particular quiet precision and concluded that what she needed was space rather than pursuit, and was providing it without being asked. She thought, he pays attention. He has always paid attention. He just used to pay attention in the service of finding weaknesses, and now he pays attention in the service of something else, and the difference between those two things is the distance between who he was and who he is choosing to be. She thought, I am in love with him. The toast was halfway to her mouth. She set it down. Examined the thought. It was, she found, not new. It had the settled quality of something that had been present for long enough to have acquired mass, to have stopped being a possibility and become simply a fact of the interior landscape, the way the lake was a fact of the exterior one, large and deep and always there, regardless of whether you were looking at it. She was in love with Draco Malfoy. She picked up her toast and finished it with the composure of someone who has just learned something important and is taking it seriously. She found him in the corridor outside the potions classroom at 2:30, between afternoon lessons, in the specific dead hour of the school day, when the corridors emptied of purpose, and the castle held itself in a kind of suspended institutional breath. He was leaning against the stone wall with his bag at his feet, his head tilted back slightly, eyes closed, and the expression on his face in this unwatched moment was one she had not seen before. Not the private penance, not the controlled surface, not the new unclassified one. This was simply rest. The complete, unguarded rest of someone who has set everything down for 60 seconds and is existing without armor. She stopped. She stood in the corridor and looked at him, and felt the fact of what she knew about herself this morning settle into the present moment with a weight that was not heavy but was absolutely real. He opened his eyes. He looked at her without adjusting his expression immediately. That half-second of unguarded arrival, of being caught in rest, and then the gentle reassembly. But slower than usual. Slower, she thought, because he was less certain of the need for it. "Hi," she said. The word was simple and inadequate, and she said it anyway. "Hi," he said. The corridor was empty. Somewhere above them, a clock marked the half-hour with a tone that resonated in the stone and faded. The smell of old potions drifted under the classroom door, burnt copper and boomslang, and the ghost of 1,000 previous lessons. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know." He watched her. "You have a specific face for it." "I have a specific face for everything, apparently." "You do?" Not unkindly, with the warmth that had been emerging in him incrementally, like something long underground finding its way toward light. "What have you been thinking about?" She crossed the corridor and stood in front of him, close, within the distance where warmth registered and breath became mutual, the same distance as the dungeon stairwell, chosen deliberately this time rather than arrived at. She looked at him directly. "I've been thinking about what I want," she said, "and what I'm afraid of, and whether the second thing is a good reason to refuse the first thing." He was very still. The silver ring caught the corridor's grey light. "What did you conclude?" he said. "That fear is data," she said. "It tells you something matters. It doesn't tell you to stop." She held his gaze with a steadiness that was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it, which was different and more honest. "I've been pulling away from you, not because I want to, because wanting things this much makes me—" She stopped, selected the precise word, the honest one. "Frightened. Of being wrong. Of it going wrong." His jaw held the familiar tension, the sub-hinge pressure of something kept. His eyes had the undefended quality they acquired when he had decided to stop managing what they showed. "I'm frightened too," he said. The words were quiet and level and cost him something visible, a slight adjustment in his breathing, the silver ring pressing into his palm as his hand closed. "I'm frightened of being the wrong choice for you." He looked at her steadily. "I have been, historically, a very wrong choice." "You've also been," she said, "the person who knows which sound I make when an equation resolves. The person who gives me room when I need it without being asked. The person who says true things plainly and then doesn't take them back." She paused. "History is data too, but it's not the only data." Something moved across his face. The new expression, the one she'd been cataloguing, and now she had a classification for it. She could see it clearly in the grey corridor light. It was hope, and underneath the hope, disbelief, and underneath the disbelief, the tentative and enormous possibility of being allowed to believe. "Hermione," he said. "I know," she said. "I know it's complicated. I know it doesn't make obvious sense. I know there are 17 reasons it would be easier not to—" She stopped because his expression had shifted, and what was in it now was not complicated at all, was in fact the simplest and most legible thing she had ever seen on his face. He looked, plainly and without disguise, as though she was something worth having. She felt it reach her in the chest and stay there. "There's something I should tell you," he said. His voice had the lower, rougher quality of the stairwell. "Something I should have said before. I didn't, because I wasn't." He paused, the sub-hinge tension working. "I wasn't certain you'd want to hear it." She waited. "The first time I came to the eastern alcove," he said, "it wasn't because of the acoustics." He held her gaze with the directness that cost him and that he spent anyway. "It was because you were there. I wanted to be near you. I've wanted to be near you for considerably longer than is comfortable to admit." The silver ring, the grey light. "I don't know what to do with that except tell you." The corridor was very quiet. She felt everything she had been managing and containing and processing and refusing to write down rise in her chest and press against the inside of her ribs with the force of something that has been kept too long in too small a space. She thought, "Write it down." She thought, "Say it." Draco. The classroom door opened. Professor Slughorn emerged in a cloud of congratulatory self-importance and stopped at the sight of them with the delighted expression of someone who has walked into a scene they will recount at dinner parties for years. "Miss Granger, Mr. Malfoy. Excellent timing. I've just been reviewing the practicals from Tuesday, and I must say, your collaborative work." He talked for 4 minutes. She stood in the corridor and listened, and felt the moment close over like water closing over a stone, leaving only the surface, smooth and undisturbed. And when Slughorn finally moved on down the corridor with his robes billowing and his satisfaction intact, she looked at Draco and found him looking back at her with the expression of someone exercising extraordinary patience. The corner of his mouth moved, not the provisional, almost smile. Something fuller, something that reached further, something that rearranged his face into a version of itself she had not seen before and wanted, with a fervour that surprised her, to see again. "I'll be in the library tonight," he said. "Eastern alcove, 8 o'clock. She looked at him, at the fullness of that unfamiliar expression, at the silver ring and the grey light, and the warmth of him in the cold corridor, and the 17 reasons, and the one reason that outweighed all of them. "I'll be there," she said. And she walked away down the corridor, and the thing in her chest was no longer aching. It was simply full. She arrived at 5 minutes to 8, not because she was eager, or rather, not only because she was eager, which was a distinction she had stopped pretending mattered. She arrived at 5 minutes to 8 because she had spent the intervening hours since the corridor in a state of focused, productive work that had the quality of someone burning through everything in front of them, so that nothing remained between themselves and the thing they are moving toward. She had finished her arithmancy assessment. She had written 3 pages of her magical law notes. She had eaten dinner with Ginny and said approximately a third of the right things in the right order, and hoped the remaining 2/3 had not been noticeably absent. Ginny had looked at her with the sharp, affectionate perception she always deployed when something was being not said, and had not pressed. And Hermione had been grateful with a completeness she couldn't express without explaining the reason for it. She packed a bag anyway, parchment, inkwell, reference texts, because arriving to the eastern alcove without them would have been a kind of declaration she wasn't ready to make explicitly, and because the presence of work materials maintained the fiction, useful to both of them, that this was simply what they did on Thursday evenings. The library was quiet in the specific way of late November. The cold had settled into the stone more thoroughly as the month deepened, and the remaining students who used the space after dinner clustered near the middle stacks where Madame Pince's warming charms were strongest, leaving the eastern alcove in its usual private amber. Hermione moved through the library with the familiarity of 8 weeks of Thursday evenings, past the advanced arithmetic theory shelf, past the untouched encyclopedias smelling of cedar and patient decay, around the column that marked the alcove's entrance. He was there, not working. His bag was on the floor and his parchment was on the table, but his quill was uncapped and unused, resting beside the inkwell with the slight imprecision of something set down without thought. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table and his eyes on the middle distance, and he turned when she arrived with the immediate attention of someone who has not been thinking about anything except the moment of arrival. She sat across from him. She did not unpack her bag. They looked at each other across the candlelit table in the amber and cedar quiet of the eastern alcove, and the thing that had been building between them for 8 weeks, through library evenings and dungeon stairwells and potions practicals and blue fire common rooms and corridor confessions interrupted by Slughorn at the worst possible moment, pressed against the present with the force of its own accumulated weight. "You came," he said. "I said I would." "I know." Something in his expression. "I believed you. I just—" The sub-hinge tension, the slight close of his right hand. "I wanted to see it." She felt the warmth of that, the plain, undefended admission of wanting, move through her chest in a slow wave. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what I was going to say to you tonight." She set her bag on the floor beside her chair. "I had several versions. Each one was more structured than the last, which is generally a sign that I'm afraid of something." "What were you afraid of?" "Saying too much." She held his gaze. "And then I thought, when has saying too much ever been the thing I regret? I always regret the things I didn't say, the moments I edited myself out of." She placed her hands on the table, a mirroring of his, flat, open, present. "So, I'm not going to do that." He was absolutely still. "You asked me once," she said, "what I was actually asking, in the library the first night, and I said I didn't know yet." The candlelight moved across the table between them, warm and unsteady, and entirely indifferent to the significance of the moment. "I know now." "Tell me," he said, and his voice was the low, rough quality of the stairwell, the underneath voice, the one that lived behind the careful surface. "I'm asking," she said, "whether this is something, whether you want it to be something. Not a variable I haven't named yet, not an asterisk in the margin, not something we circle without ever saying directly." She was aware of her own heartbeat, steady, elevated, present. "I want to know if you're in this, actually in it. Not because the stairwell—" She paused, navigated around the thing that needed navigating around. "Not because of any single moment, because of all of them, because of 8 weeks of Thursday evenings, and the way you said my name the first time, and the note on my pillow, and the fact that you know which sound I make when an equation resolves." The candles between them held their amber breath. Draco looked at her across the table with a new expression, the one that had taken her weeks to classify and that she could now read with complete clarity. And his hands, flat on the table, shifted. Not toward her, not yet. Simply a repositioning, the slight movement of someone gathering themselves before something significant. I have been in it, he said, for considerably longer than 8 weeks. He said it with the quietness of a thing spoken for the first time that has been true for a long time. I started coming to the eastern alcove because you were here. I started listening for you in rooms you weren't in. I started... He stopped. The jaw tension, the sub-hinge pressure of the thing kept, and then, with a visible and deliberate release, I started rearranging everything around where you might be, and I told myself it was proximity, habit. I am very good at not naming things I don't know what to do with. So am I, she said. I know. The corner of his mouth, not the provisional thing, not the unfinished expression, something fuller and more vulnerable than either. We've been very impressively not naming the same thing. For quite a while, she agreed. Yes. The word settled between them with the weight of an admission. She felt it land, felt the space it created, not empty space, but cleared space, the kind that exists after something long held has been set down at last, and the air rushes in to fill the shape of it. She moved first, not dramatically. She pushed back her chair and stood, and walked the 3 steps around the end of the table that separated their sides, and she stopped in front of him, and he turned in his chair to face her, and she was close enough now that the frost and pine was fully present, was simply the air she was breathing, and his face was tilted up toward hers, and the candlelight was doing its amber work on the sharp angles of it, and his eyes were the colour of old silver, and entirely, completely unguarded. He stood. The movement brought him within inches of her, not touching, the same charged not touching as every threshold they had approached and retreated from across 8 weeks. And his height meant she had to tilt her chin slightly upward, and his meant he had to angle his face slightly down, and the geometry of it felt, in this moment, like something that had been finding its proper configuration for a long time. I'm not going to manage this perfectly, he said. I should tell you that now. I have considerable practice at being composed and very little practice at being... He searched, selected, open. I will get it wrong. I will probably retreat and need to be... A slight pause, something almost rueful in the curve of his mouth. Retrieved. I'm aware, she said. I'm not particularly easy either. I overthink everything. I argue when I'm frightened. I will absolutely correct you when you're wrong, and you'll find it insufferable. I already find it insufferable, he said. I also find it the fuller expression, the one that reached further. I find it entirely impossible to look away from. She felt it in the fine bones of her sternum, in the warm, filled weight of her chest, in the place where the asterisk had been, where the aching space had been, where she had spent 8 weeks refusing to write the thing she knew. She reached up and placed her hand against his jaw, her fingers against the sharp line of it, her palm against the warmth of his skin, and she felt him receive the touch the way he received everything she gave him, completely, with absolute attention, the silver ring cool against her wrist where his hand came up to cover hers, not holding it in place, simply present. His hand over hers, the way things between them had always worked. Not force, not demand, simply the closing of a circuit that had been open too long. Draco, she said. Hermione, he said, and in the saying of it, she heard everything she had heard the first time. The careful, deliberate reaching of someone learning a new language. And underneath that, new now, the sound of someone who has learned it, who has arrived. She closed the remaining distance. The kiss was not what she had imagined. She had imagined, against her better editorial judgment, some version of the dramatic, some version shaped by 8 weeks of accumulated tension, releasing all at once into something overwhelming. What it was instead was quiet. His mouth against hers with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Complete, unhurried, as though the only thing that existed was this exact point of contact and the present moment that contained it. Warm where she had expected cool, certain where she had expected tentative. His hand moved from hers to her face, the other hand, the one without the ring, and cupped her jaw with a gentleness that had nothing performed about it, that was simply what it was. And she felt the slight tremor in his fingers, the single involuntary thing he did not manage, and it undid her more thoroughly than anything certain could have. She kissed him back with everything she had not said, with the asterisk and the margin and the 7-word note and the sound she made when an equation resolved, and the 4 days she had spent not coming to the library, and the name she had finally, this morning, written down in the place where it belonged. When they separated, it was by inches only. His forehead tipped against hers, both of them breathing the same small circle of air in the amber quiet of the eastern alcove. She could feel his heartbeat. Her hand had found its way to his chest at some point, and beneath her palm his heart was doing something considerably less composed than the rest of him usually managed. "Still frightened," he said. She considered honestly. "Yes," she said, "less than before." His hands were at her waist. She noticed this the way you notice, belatedly, something that is felt immediately and entirely correct. "That's enough," he said. "For now." "For now," she agreed. She pulled back enough to look at him properly. His expression was the new one, still without a clean category, still the thing she had spent weeks trying to classify. But she understood it fully now. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for long enough that its presence has become unremarkable, and who has just, unexpectedly, felt someone else take a portion of it. Not removed, shared, distributed, made bearable not by being lessened, but by being held between 2 people instead of 1. She understood it because she was wearing the same expression. She could feel it in her own face, the loosening, the released structural tension, the specific quality of a person no longer bracing against a thing they have stopped needing to brace against alone. "The library closes at midnight," she said. "I know. We have 3 hours. We do." She stepped back, not away, simply back, into the space that allowed them to breathe as separate people rather than a single configuration. She retrieved her chair from where she'd pushed it. She sat. She opened her bag and extracted her parchment and inkwell and arranged them with the automatic efficiency of habit. She looked up. He was looking at her with the fuller expression, the one that reached further. And the candlelight was doing its amber work, and the cedar and decay smell of the old encyclopedias was reliable and constant, and the eastern alcove was exactly what it had always been, exactly the quiet, private corner she had chosen 8 weeks ago for its solitude, and it was not solitary now. It was something better than solitary. He sat, uncapped his quill, bent over his parchment in the familiar posture, the small, precise letters beginning their progress across the page. She began her own work. The torches held their amber. The library breathed its sleeping breath around them. Somewhere in the deep Hogwarts night, the castle settled into itself with the ancient patience of stone that has held centuries of human feeling in its walls and expects to hold centuries more. She made the small sound of satisfaction when the 8th calculation resolved. She heard, from across the table, a sound she had not heard before, low and warm and entirely unguarded. Not a laugh exactly, something quieter, something that lived in the same register as the sound she made for resolved equations, the same register of things that resolve, things that find their proper shape at last. She looked up. He was looking at her. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The asterisk had a name. The variable had a value. The equation, long and complicated and full of terms that had seemed irreconcilable, had resolved into something clear and warm and absolutely, finally true. She looked back at her parchment and smiled.
This story is about two people who are afraid to want something real, afraid to say the truth out loud. Hermione thinks she is strong enough to feel nothing. Draco thinks he is too broken to deserve anything. They are both wrong. This story not about magic, not about Hogwarts, about the moment you stop running from a feeling and just let it be there. We all know that moment when something is growing inside you and you keep telling yourself, no, this is nothing, I'm fine, I don't need this. And then one day you are sitting by a fire and someone is holding your hand and you realize you have been waiting for this for a very long time. Draco never chased her, he just stayed near, quietly, patiently, until she was ready to stay too. I think that is the most romantic thing a person can do. Not grand words, not big gestures, just I'm here. I am not going anywhere. If this story made you feel something, that feeling is yours. Keep it. Thank you for listening.